For our first session, cities have all throughout history risen and fallen. But what makes some cities more resilient than others? And what's the catalyst for renewal and change? Here to share his opening thoughts is my husband, Richard Florida, who's also an international best-selling author. You may have heard of some of his books, Rise of the Creative Class and Who's Your City? And he's a global research professor at NYU and the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Please welcome Richard to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Rana, for having this vision to really think about the future of this amazing city and really the future of all cities. And I just want to echo Rana's thanks too. I'm really fortunate. I'm lucky I gave that speech in Lansing. They say sometimes the stories you tell about how you met, there's a great new study that reflects the strength of your relationship. I came to Lansing, Michigan expecting to do nothing else but to give a speech, and it was the greatest day of my life. My team is amazing. Reham and Stephen and our extended family here is amazing. Look, I don't have to tell all of you that this city is on the way back. It is. If you were watching the video feed, you'd see with the Atlantic, with support from the Atlantic, we came here several years ago. Ron and Reham and Stephen would know. I forget these things. Several years ago with our friends and did a video series on what was happening in downtown Detroit and the seeds that were emerging there. And, you know, I think about that, and I think about just those few years ago, or I think about the night in 1984 I was here, the night the Tigers won the World Series. And what has happened is truly remarkable. You know, I'm a kid who was born in Newark, New Jersey, probably the only city in the world that was more hard hit than this city. And we have Don Katz here with us from Newark today and what's happening there. But the amazing transformation that's happened here, I had a few statistics that I pulled. The Detroit area now has more than 500,000 people in what I came to call the creative class. That's scientists, technologists, entrepreneurs, researchers, artists, designers, entertainers, media workers. It has 375,000 people in the working class, this great city of industry and of manufacturing. And that's not just people who make things, that's people who drive trucks and do construction. There are 150 to 200,000 more people already in this knowledge-based industry. And I think one of the things we want to talk about today is not just what went wrong and what went right, but where do we go from here? And that's really, I guess, the spirit behind this Create Detroit event. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And how do we learn from others? And I think there's two things that I want to focus on, that our team wants to focus on, and we want you to focus on. The first one is, obviously, as this transformation has occurred, as startups have moved downtown, as there's more than $1 billion in investment from Dan Gilbert and others, as the Cass Corridor has blossomed, as this whole downtown has come together, I think the first thing that's come up as an increasingly important narrative in this city is how do you rebuild a city that's not just for the haves and just doesn't have a divide between the haves and the have-nots? How do you build a Detroit where newcomers and younger people and the creative class can contribute, but where folks who have made this part of this city and the urban core their home, the locations of their businesses, how everyone can prosper? And the word I'll use is how do we create an urbanism not just for the privileged, not just for the creative class, but an urbanism for all? And I think that's really important. And the conversations we've devised, bringing people here from Newark or Miami, San Francisco, Queens, how have those communities grappled with this? And I think there's a kind of an advantage here, even though those tensions are starting to simmer a little, In Toronto, we've recently hosted the Chief of Staff to London Mayor Boris Johnson. He spent 6 months with us in our institute. And Toronto's a city that's a pretty successful global city, and he said something that I'll never forget. He said, maybe you don't want the problems of New York or London and San Francisco. Cities where housing becomes so expensive, where only the truly rich increasingly can afford housing, and where many buildings actually the lights are turned off. A subject I'm going to grapple with in my new book that's coming out in the spring called The New Urban Crisis. So how does Detroit take this enormous advantage of affordable housing, affordable space, this brand and opportunity set that's on the world stage, and how does it carve out a unique path to rebuilding itself as a global city, one that is both economically creative and prosperous, but also quintessentially inclusive? And the other theme I want to talk about, and I want everyone to consider, is this other great divide in Detroit between the urban center and its suburbs. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to address the chamber here. And I never remember exactly what I say in a speech, but one line I remember. Because I said this idea that you could rebuild a city in the suburbs was crazy. That this idea that for so many years that somehow an edge city could be created that would replicate the functions of the city and one could abandon the city never made any sense. And that the suburbs had to come to the table. In this process of urban regeneration and revitalization, there was a burden on the suburbs to come to the table and to help in this process of urban revitalization, not out of philanthropy or generosity, because having a vibrant urban center and a vibrant urban core was critical for the long-run success of the entire region. Now, I've looked at the data. I wrote a very detailed piece, an essay for The Atlantic, our Site City Lab. I wrote pieces on the divides in many of America's great cities, New York and San Francisco. I also did London, Houston, Dallas, Los Angeles. But I took a detailed look at Detroit, not just in the aggregate, but at its neighborhood level. And when you do that, when you look at the economic geography of this region, you see a set of overlapping divides. The first thing you find is this incredible rejuvenation in and around the downtown core, in and around this 7 or 8 or even 10-mile area that subsumes the Cass Corridor and parts of the waterfront and radiates out from here, and that's all happening. And then you find, of course, this big void in the middle of entrenched poverty, of abandonment, of homelessness, and of areas of true need. And once you get out into the suburbs, you find areas of knowledge work, of the creative class, and of technology that are the same levels that you would find in San Francisco or Palo Alto. When you look at communities out near Birmingham and Bloomfield, and we have the data, you have 70 or 80 or 85% of the workforce in the creative class. What's really interesting is if you look at the manufacturing and working base of this region, it's no longer in the city. There are pockets. But it's in Pontiac, and it's out in Romulus, and it's out in further afield. In fact, in our maps, the big blotches of manufacturing and industry are far out in areas of the exurbs and rural communities. What's left behind in the inner city is the largest class of all. And we'll be issuing a report from our institute on this. It's the service class. The service class is the largest class of all workers in America. 70 million people toil in the service class. They're the people who prepare our food, who serve us in restaurants and hotels, take care of our children or our aging parents, help us out in retail stores. If the members of the creative class make $70 or $80 or $90 or $100,000, if members of the working class make on average $35 or $40 or $50,000, and in great cities with great unions like Detroit made upwards of 6 figures, members of the service class incomes barely touch $30,000. 70 million Americans, half our population. And every single neighborhood, every single tract that had the largest share of this hardworking but underpaid service class was in and around the urban center. You get it. A group of knowledge workers in the core and out in the suburbs, manufacturing that's moved out to the exurbs, and a large parts of a great city populated with underpaid, struggling service workers who work in contingent and precarious conditions, 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs a family. And I think one of the things we have to focus on today and in our work is how do we make those jobs good jobs? I tell a lot of stories about my own father. You know, my dad was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey. He took up work in a factory in the midst of the Great Depression when he was 13, went and stormed the beaches at Normandy. And when he came back, he said, "Rich, I had a terrible job when I left for the war. It took 9 of us, your grandma, your grandpa, and all 7 kids to make a single family wage. And we lived in a home that we shared with 2 other of our aunts and uncles' families. And as if by magic, when I returned from the war and I went back to work in that same factory in the great ironbound district of Newark, I had a good, high-paying job that I could buy a house outside of Newark in a very tough and rough and tumble working-class suburb of New Jersey, North Arlington. And I could put you 2 boys, my brother Richard and Robert, classic Italian names, you'll all know that. I can put you 2 boys through college. But it wasn't by magic. We took those dirty and dangerous manufacturing jobs, and we made them good jobs. We had an enormous union movement that galvanized this country. And my dad always said that, even though his shop wasn't unionized. The unions created the capacity in the Wagner Act and the capacity collective bargaining for our wages to rise. We had a government, a president, who undertook to build a social safety net. And those jobs that it took 9 people to make a family wage were miraculously turned into good middle-class jobs. And we invented a new way of living, the suburbs, which fueled our factories and created more good jobs. Those cars coming out of Detroit's assembly lines, that steel coming out of Pittsburgh, those washing machines and dryers coming from the great American Midwest, those air conditioners. As people's wages rose, they bought suburban homes and they filled them up with cars and appliances, and we had a great golden age. What we're going through here in Detroit, ground zero, is the death of that old age. That's what the economic crisis was about. The economic crisis of 2008 and 2009 wasn't just about financial shenanigans or a housing market that was in a bubble. Of course it was. It was the death of an old way of life and an old growth model. What we're at is the beginnings of creating a new growth model. Out of this crisis, we have to grow a new way of working and a new way of living. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that here in Detroit and in places like San Francisco and New York and Newark and Miami. How do we do that? Well, I think there's 3 prongs that we want to talk about as we ground this conversation from the big picture to the how-to. The first thing that we're going to have to figure out is how to create new good jobs. How do we take these 70 million low-paying jobs? What do we do to make them better jobs? And of course, higher minimum wages that mayors across the country are pioneering. Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles, $15 an hour minimum wage. Every city, every metropolitan area needs to set its minimum wage in line with its local cost of living. How do we begin to work to make our service jobs better? We have folks here from Zappos in Las Vegas, which is working on both sides of this coin. But one of the things Zappos has learned, and other great service companies have learned, if you empower worker in service jobs, if you take those retail clerks and office workers and service workers, and you pay them better, and you give them a stake in the company, and you treat them like human beings, just like we paid factory workers better, and just like we asked them to contribute, and we organized them in quality circles and continuous improvement to make the factories hum. If you do that with retail workers, as Zappos has done, and increase promotion from within, let people go from the bottom and rise up through the organization, You get higher productivity, higher rates of innovation, and higher profit. There's a great young woman at MIT in the Sloan School of Management there who talks about this. She calls it the good job strategy. And she finds in company after company after company in the retail and food preparation and restaurant business that does this, profits soar. At the end of the day, and you folks in Detroit know this, yes, it was a great thing that we paid the people who made our cars and made our steel and made our washing machines and refrigerators, that we paid them a living wage, a human wage, a family-supporting wage. But what about the people who take care of our kids and take care of our aging parents and serve us food and take care of us with our sick? You might argue that they even more deserve to be paid a family-supporting wage because we depend on them so importantly. And then we're going to talk about the housing side of the picture. You know, increasingly what we're finding around the country and around the world, and I think it's what's driving this renaissance, this boom, right here in downtown Detroit, is that old idea of an American dream that so motivated my mom and dad. They wanted to move out of Newark, New Jersey, that Italian ghetto where the aunts and uncles were looking over their shoulder, and get a car, buy that Chevy or Buick or Oldsmobile. My dad had all of the above, and drive out to the burbs where they could find their freedom. But today, people have a different dream. So many of us don't have family and friends around. We're moving to places where anonymous. We want a community. And what's driving this is a search for new ways of living that create community, that create neighborhood, that have less of an obnoxious carbon footprint, that are more sustainable. We heard from young people in New York, out in Brooklyn and Queens and all of these neighborhoods just last week. They don't want to optimize their net worth. They want to optimize their net freedom. They want a lifestyle that enables them to do the things they love, to have meaning and purpose. And you know where they said so much of this meaning and purpose comes from? Of course it comes from family. But it comes from being in the kind of place they want to be and giving back. All the research tells this. The people who are happiest and most successful and most at peace with themselves are not just the ones who accumulate a lot of things, but give back. And that's what we're at the earliest stages of. How do we make sure that we have the right kind of housing? How do we make sure that we're developing the right kinds of housing? Not just in Detroit, but in places like in San Francisco and New York, and the big asset is the provision of affordable housing. And what about transport? How do we begin to think about a city and a community that's no longer so solely dependent on the car? Those are the kinds of things that we're just at the beginning of. We're not waking up with this fully formed. We're just at the beginning of this. And one other point. I've lived a lot of places in my life, and I've tracked urban transformation in a lot of different cities. I got a scholarship to go to Rutgers College, and that took me out of a working class neighborhood and put me on a different path. But when I was a graduate student, I went off to school at Boston. Now you look at Boston today and you say, wow, a tech, knowledge, creative class center of the world. San Francisco, Boston, and a few other communities define this knowledge age. They're amazingly successful. When I lived in Boston in the early 1980s, it was still grappling with economic transformation. The area around MIT, where I went to school, didn't look like this. Didn't look like this area. It had burnt out old industrial buildings, and I noticed the White Castle right across the street. In fact, I might have to go visit later. It had one little diner where faculty members and graduate students would. Now that's an area now that is filled with some of the largest and most important tech companies in the world, as those tech companies go right up and down the transit lines in Boston and Cambridge. In fact, Cambridge has more venture capital investment than Boston as a whole. It took a generation for Boston to recover from the loss of its textile and boot and shoe industry to become what it is today. In 1987, I moved to Pittsburgh. I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. When I moved to Pittsburgh, it suffered from the loss of 150,000 manufacturing jobs. It saw its population shrink from 900,000 people to 300,000 people. And now, President Obama visits Pittsburgh, and the light shines as Pittsburgh as the place that has turned it around. My old university, Carnegie Mellon, was a little bit upset in the past couple of weeks When I was there used to be these robotic cars and robotic tanks 20 years ago that rolled around the parking lot. It was the leading center for this kind of research in the world. Uber has just set up its biggest and most important research institute on driverless vehicles and literally took the entire faculty and made them Uber employees. It's actually a good thing for Pittsburgh because it creates more opportunity. But the fact of the matter is that was another generational project. That was another 30 to 50-year rebuilding effort. These transformations don't happen overnight. And I think Detroit is in this very unique position in that if we're smart, if you're smart, urbanists, city builders, developers, entrepreneurs, creative class, you can chart a different path. You don't have to be like Boston or San Francisco or New York or London. You can develop a path which provides the capacity to do what you want, to do what you love, to rebuild your city, but to do it in a way that avoids those big-scale problems. I know you sit here and you go, oh my God, could we only imagine that housing would be completely unaffordable? It's coming. Could we only imagine that people couldn't afford to have startup space? If you don't plan for it, it will hit you. Who would have thought that the burned out areas on the Brooklyn waterfront, where nobody would go, apartments are selling for $1,000, $2,000 a foot and more? Who would have thought that Pittsburgh, that lost 600,000 people, could rise up and become a center for the research operations of some of the greatest companies in the world? Who would have thought that hippy-dippy San Francisco and the Summer of Love, they would find it impossible for young people to be able to afford a home or to create a startup? Who would have thought that in central Miami, in an area with one-story old battered buildings, with vision and foresight and investment in the arts and vision and foresight, and we'll talk about this with Matt Hagman, could become a center not only for arts and culture, but for startup companies from the United States and all of Latin America. Look, this is our new dream. It's not my parents' dream anymore. It's not a dream of just a good job and a nice car and a house in the suburbs, all great things. It's a job of finding a place and doing a thing that you love and doing it on your own terms, optimizing your net freedom. And as we craft this path in Detroit, it's important to recognize that and to recognize the history and to recognize the great history of innovation. Look, this is still remains still of the most innovative places on the planet. I have the numbers. It is the #1 center for industrial design in the world. It is, in terms of popular culture and popular arts and popular music, it remains the world's definitive creative incubator. You know all of this. It has propagated more musical genres and musical styles than any other place on the face of the earth. So creativity and innovation is in this place's DNA. And I think if you think about it, it's not just the innovative and the creative side that Detroit defined. It's the how do we build a new American dream side. This is the place that factory workers finally got a better go. This is where it all went down. This is the place that said to the old working class, you too can be part of the mix. You too deserve to have a good standard of living. You too deserve to have a home. You too, not just the managers and the elites and the capitalist class, you too can be part of an American dream. This was the place that propelled the old dream of suburbia. This was the place that said we can build roads and highways and get you to that dream home plus a lakefront cottage. It not only achieved innovation and creativity, Detroit's great contribution is that it built a new way of life that everyone could be part of. That's why we're here today. How do we build not just a creative Detroit, not just an innovative Detroit? How do we build an inclusive urban Detroit that bridges the divide that's been going on too long between city and suburb and make sure that every single person, that newcomer who moves here from San Francisco or New York or Boston or London, England, or Miami Beach, that young artist who moves here and says, I can do it in Detroit because it's cheaper and I can live better. And how do we make sure that everyone who's been here for a heck of a long time is part of that mix? Can build their own startup, can build their own business that has the assistance they need, or can get a job paying a real living and family supporting wage. Well, that's what we're here to talk about.